Thanks, Deanna, and good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here tonight to welcome you all to the UBC Dialogues. Scotiabank is committed to supporting the communities in which we live and work. And like UBC Dialogues, we believe that different ideas and perspectives contribute to a strong and healthy society, one that fosters an inclusive culture and celebrates talent and diversity. And so we're proud to be partnering with our friends at Alumni UBC on this fantastic series of events. Tonight we're in for a real treat, as we'll hear from another outstanding lineup of panelists, and it's now my pleasure to welcome our moderator for the evening. Born and raised in the Lower Mainland, UBC alumnus Dan Burritt is host and producer of CBC Vancouver News. He has reported on a wide range of breaking stories in the region, including the Lower Mainland gang wars in 2008 and 9, the 2010 Vancouver Winter Olympics, and the Haida Gwaii earthquake of 2012. He has an extensive background in election coverage, covering both provincial and federal elections since 2008. Prior to CBC, Dan spent 6.5 years as a radio anchor and reporter. He was awarded the Broadcast Performer of Tomorrow, awarded by the British Columbia Association of Broadcasters in 2010. To guide us along in tonight's dialogue, please join me in a warm welcome for our moderator, Dan Burritt.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you to all of you for coming. I think we have a full room. This is fabulous. I want to thank you for inviting me back to moderate this important discussion at CBC News. If you read, if you're online, if you listen on radio, if you watch on television, climate issues and pipelines are regularly in our newscast. In fact, you may have heard on your way in or saw on your way in CBC Vancouver senior meteorologist Johanna Wagstaff, colleague and good friend, along with some of our other colleagues at the Corp, have been working on a 6-part podcast series called 2050 Degrees of Change. This series explores how British Columbia's climate will change in about 30 years and what that means for our daily life. And you're welcome to drop by the CBC table after the event tonight. You can have a listen to part of the first podcast at that reception tonight. So I encourage you to do that. On to tonight's discussion, and what a timely one it is. Are Canada's pipeline approvals at odds with our climate commitments? Before anybody answers, please, we'll just keep going. For years, the possibility of new and expanded pipelines running across our province have raised questions related to First Nations and Indigenous land rights, coastal tanker traffic, the nature of inter-provincial relationships. I can think of at least one. Underlying these questions, however, has always been the larger question of how we are continuing to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure at all, given our international climate commitments. We all know Paris. Political positions on pipelines and the environment only make the issue more complicated, especially in our current provincial climate. How or can we find a balance between the pipelines and the environment? To help us navigate this complex issue, it is my pleasure to introduce a very esteemed panel for tonight. I'm going to welcome them to the stage now. As they get comfortable, I'll give them each a very brief introduction. We can't go through all the bios, but they are impressive, and we'll take some of the highlights. If you'd all like to come up now. First, for over 37 years, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip has worked with the Penticton Indian Band administration, holding a variety of positions. He's proud to be in his 5th 3-year term as the president of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. He's taken an active role in the defense of Aboriginal title and rights by readily offering support to Native communities in need, and has taken a personal approach in that defense, including standing with elders of Treaty 8 against oil and gas development in the Peace River. UBC alumnus Catherine Harrison is a professor of political science in the UBC Faculty of Arts. Her research focuses primarily on environmental policy in 2 main areas. The first, comparative analysis to understand why governments adopt the policies they do. The second, evaluates the efficacy of alternative policy instruments. She's the author of the book Passing the Buck: Federalism and Canadian Environmental Policy, and co-author George Hoberg of Risk, Science and Politics. And just to her left is George Hoberg, professor at the Lew Institute for Global Issues at UBC. As of July 1st, he's going to be within the UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. His research interests include environmental policy, energy policy, forest policy, and more generally the design of policies and institutions to promote sustainability. His current research focuses on the clean energy transformation. I'm sure we're going to talk about that tonight. He's writing a book on the resistance to oil sands pipelines and the challenges and opportunities of the clean energy transformation. To his left is Solomon Rees, is Tsimshian and Saulteaux, and is passionate about creating own-source revenue projects for First Nations and Indigenous organizations. He's president and CEO of Four Eagles Sustainable Development Corporation. It's a project incubator with a specialization in housing, technology, wind, and solar energy. They help provide communities with the resources required to transition to own-source revenue generation and out of poverty management. And finally, UBC alumnus Stuart Muir is the Executive Director of Resource Works, a nonprofit agency that demonstrates how responsible development of our natural resources in BC creates jobs and incomes throughout the province, indirectly and directly, while maintaining a clean and healthy environment. And Resource Works explores the long-term economic future of British Columbia as a place that depends on the responsible development, extraction, and transportation of our province's resources. A few comments before we continue about the format for tonight's event. We're going to be asking our panelists a number of questions for the next half hour or so before we go to that Q&A period where we'll be taking questions from you via the audience engagement platform. So if you want to throw those questions in now, feel free to input your questions as we have the discussion on stage. Now we're going to finish with a reception where you can continue to chat with anybody you like about what we're talking about tonight, everyone up here on the stage. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation because we have such a great variety of perspectives on a very controversial topic, and topics really, and we're lucky our speakers are here to share their views and have a very productive conversation. Important that we all are respectful of the various viewpoints. We appreciate you, all of our speakers in advance for their openness, and all of you for respecting all the viewpoints that we hear tonight. Let's get started. I'm going to start with and switch over my microphone, in fact. We're going to start off with the overall question. And we want to find out where each of our speakers stands on this issue. Don't feel the need to address everything right away, because we're going to get into a little bit later. But the overall question, Grand Chief Stuart Phil, I'd like to start with you. Are Canada's pipeline approvals at odds with their climate commitments?
Absolutely. We'll expand on that as we get into this.
Thank you. Catherine, over to you. Same question. Are they at odds with their climate commitments, those pipelines?
Absolutely. I would say they're at odds both domestically and internationally. Domestically, in the Paris Agreement, Canada committed to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. And last fall, the federal government and most provinces agreed to the Pan-Canadian Framework, which includes lots of good stuff, including a national price on carbon. But what gets seldom mentioned is it's not actually a plan to achieve our 2030 target. It falls short by 40-some million tons per year, which just happens to be the anticipated growth in greenhouse gas emissions associated with tar sands production. That is the only sector that is experiencing significant growth going forward to 2030, and it also accounts for most of our emissions growth domestically since 1990. Internationally, the emissions I've been talking about so far are just the extraction-related emissions. When we export that oil, it gets burned somewhere else. And the issue there is that as the rest of the countries of the world reduce their emissions in order to comply with the Paris Agreement, demand will fall, the price of oil will fall, and Canada's oil will be the first to go because it's more costly and it's more emissions intensive. So various modeling exercises predict that if we're going to achieve the 2C target, sales of Canada's bitumen exports would evaporate by 2020. So I don't see how expanding oil production is consistent with either our domestic targets or our international commitments.
George, what are your initial thoughts on this?
I agree with the first two speakers. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that when we talk about Canada's Paris commitments, it's on a time frame around 2030, which is a relatively steep reduction of 30%. That's just the initial investment on what needs to be done. The most recent science we have suggests that the climate situation is much more grave and urgent than the way we normally think about it and the political rhetoric used here in the province, across the Rockies in Alberta, and certainly by our Prime Minister. A May 2017, so quite recent study in the journal Science, which is one of the 2 top journals in the world, say if you want to try to reach that 2-degree target that has been put out by the international community, greenhouse gas emissions globally need to peak by 2020, which is right around the corner, and then every decade after that, they have to be reduced by a half. So that magnitude of change is quite stunning and suggests an urgency that's not apparent in the rhetoric of current governments. But the good news is that despite the need to acknowledge that gravity and urgency of the problem, we actually feel like we have the solution to it. The studies by engineers and economists all consistently show technologies exist and they can be put in place over that time frame between now and 2050 in a way that has a relatively minimal impact on economic growth. So it's very important to begin moving as rapidly as possible towards that clean energy transformation, and big new investments in major fossil fuel infrastructure takes us in the wrong direction.
Solomon Rees, what do you think?
So I'm going to give a conditional response. I think it's very easy to make pipelines the enemy. I think pipelines is one part of the carbon discussion. Working in the sustainability area, I mean, I work in green housing, I work in a lot of renewable technology, synthetic fuels, carbon negative, or carbon positive, making the transition from carbon positive fuels to carbon negative fuels. There's a lot of exciting technology out there, a lot of technology that my company is pursuing. But I think that dominating the discussion purely around pipelines, so conditionally I would agree, yes, that investing in heavy oil infrastructure is not in the interests of the planet. However, I think looking at the petrol industry and what it contributes to this country, completely counting it out of part of that process of transition, I feel like is a perspective that's very important, because petrol or fuel or oil is an incredibly valuable resource to us, and we shouldn't be shutting down all infrastructure around it. It's a part of almost everything that we use, and it's a very common thing that a lot of people like to talk about. So I suppose that's my conditional answer. That on the face of it, yes, it is not in keeping with those commitments. However, I think the discussion needs to be widened more than just pipelines and how we necessarily treat this infrastructure.
Well, we're going to widen the discussion, but I want to hear from Stuart Muir lastly. Are our pipeline approvals at odds with our climate commitments? Last word on that question to you.
No, I don't think they're at odds with our climate commitments. I'm waiting for the boo hiss. Okay. The reason I say that is that the variables around all of the innovation happening in this country and many other places are not fixed or deterministic. If you look at what's happening in the Canadian oil sands or other areas where Canadian petroleum products are extracted, we are moving towards the zero carbon barrel of oil in Canada. And that is the thing that those who are treating today's factors as fixed invariably forever, I think would do well to acknowledge, because if you consider the structure that the federal government has agreed to in Paris, that the provinces have been brought into line on, you look at the investments in innovation that the country's committed to, and if you do all that, and then you insist that the variables you're dealing with in terms of industrial performance are fixed always at some point in time in 1990 or something, I think that does a disservice to those in our universities and our industries who are perhaps not overrepresented in a room like this, but the engineering, the science who are out there at the Pipeline Integrity Institute at UBC or in areas where they're working on some of the amazing, here at UBC and other universities in Canada, the technologies to mitigate the clearly imperfect fuels that we're developing so that we can reach those targets. And actually, if you start to, and I won't go over time, I promise, if you start to examine in detail what's happening across the country, I think once you place it in the political context of what we imperfect beings can actually accomplish, we actually have probably the best story in the world in terms of being able to meet our commitments.
Oh, let's dive into that political context now. Catherine, this question is for you. 60% of British Columbians voted for change in our last election. The NDP and the Greens have now come together to pledge to stop the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline project, $7.4 billion, massive project. Where do you think we're headed on that one?
I think it's going to get kind of ugly. I think that there will be a conflict between the federal and provincial government, and the question remains, if we have, as expected, an NDP Green government, how far is Justin Trudeau willing to go, and how soon, in order to force the constitutional issue? Is he content to wait until the provincial government denies permits and then Trans Mountain challenges it and intervene? Is he willing to sue the provincial government as soon as they do something like that? And what if the step that the province takes is to back down on one of the legal challenges against the province, for instance, those by First Nations, which I'm sure Grand Chief Stewart Phillip could say more about? Would the Prime Minister be willing to weigh in and take that battle on if the province doesn't? So I think that the province could cause lots of trouble, create delay, and really test the political will of the federal government.
Grand Chief, we know, and having interviewed you before about this issue, where do you think it is headed, at least at this latest point, from what you've seen from the First Nations and Indigenous lawsuits that have been launched, to the challenges, to now Kinder Morgan saying, we don't really plan to modify this project all that much, and we plan to start building by September?
Well, I think there's just a multitude of issues that are in play here. Clearly, the outcome of this political intrigue that is frustrating the formation of a government in British Columbia is playing into all of this. Kinder Morgan is an incredibly devious company. It has roots in the scandal-ridden Enron corporation that collapsed quite some time ago. And recently we were all aware that Kinder Morgan offered an IPO to raise capital. They did that after they approached potential joint venture partners, some of the big oil companies, who basically said no thank you. They were looking toward pension funds and they were equally unsuccessful. They opted for the IPO, and if you read those documents very carefully, and I don't pretend to be an expert, but it's very much akin, in my view, to exploiting a crisis situation and putting out a very impassioned plea for a crowdfunding initiative, attracting all of that investment, and in the prospectus documents, and many places it says, please be aware that this project may not happen. But don't worry, the way we've designed this IPO, that these funds can be invested in other aspects of our larger corporation, which in my view is somewhat deceitful. But the point that I'm making is the market itself is going to make its own determination on whether this pipeline is built or not. I believe Kinder Morgan, in their heart of hearts, and I say that tongue in cheek, I think that they don't believe that this pipeline is going to happen, this long-term investment. The writing is on the wall with the fossil fuel industry. These projects are very long in tenure and whatnot, and I think the world is changing towards renewables. This project has attracted 19 lawsuits, 12 of which are First Nation lawsuits. Some of them are very, very powerful, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Musqueam. They have very high-powered legal teams that are involved. There's going to be elements of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, the commitments of Trudeau himself. We must remember that he promised to restructure the NEB process from the ground up, also the Canadian Environmental Assessment Review process. In fact, during the last federal election, he said no project should be approved until this work is done. So we all know that all they did was tack on another 4 months of a fundamentally flawed review process. All of these things are going to be challenged in court. We've been down this road before under the Harper government. Joe Oliver was saying this was in the national interest, and we'll do whatever we have to ensure Enbridge's Northern Gateway pipeline goes through. And at the end of the day, it was struck down in the courts. So I would suggest that Kinder Morgan is an incredibly long ways from home in terms of having this project. There are Indigenous groups that are out on the land as we speak, undertaking ceremonies and resolving that the pipeline is not going to be able to pass through their territories. And if you see a map of the pipeline route in Indigenous territories, there's pretty much no place on the pipeline route that is free and clear, in spite of a few highly conditional agreements between some First Nations and Kinder Morgan.
George, I'd like to pick up with you. Thank you, Grand Chief. In a practical sense, talking about ways in which this pipeline, whether it's through the courts, whether it's through protests, could be stopped, what can the province specifically do to either slow down the process or stop it?
Okay, there are some very specific legal mechanisms. The Federal Court of Appeal last year, in a case involving the Northern Gateway pipeline, made it clear that the provincial government has the requirement to make its own environmental assessment certificate. So very late in the game, the BC government did that, and it was just announced this January. And after making that determination, the province has to give out permits that would allow the pipeline company to do various things, like cut down trees. You can't cut down a tree on Crown land without having a permit from the Ministry of Forests. That gives the New Green NDP alliance the capacity, if they form government, to withdraw that certificate. So that's one potential option to do it. Another option that's been discussed is the fact that there hasn't been a health assessment done about the Kinder Morgan pipeline, and the province of British Columbia clearly has constitutional jurisdiction over health, and they could undertake a health assessment and have the pipeline slowed while that was going on. Probably the most powerful mechanism, though, is a case that Kathy referred to involving the Squamish First Nation and the BC government over the letting of that environmental assessment certificate. That's a case against the government of British Columbia, which was represented by Christy Clark. If it's represented by Andrew Weaver and John Horgan, that's an entirely different situation. They could choose to basically resolve the case because they believe that it's inconsistent with the Crown's duty to First Nations. And what Kathy was referring to, that would require, in order for the pipeline to proceed, it would require the federal government of Canada to decide they wanted to pick a fight with BC about the exact issue that Justin Trudeau made the heart of his campaign, the reconciliation with First Nations. So it makes it really stronger than the legal tools are how the political calculation shifts when the BC government shifts and they begin to exercise these tools under provincial jurisdiction.
Solomon, to a little bit about the economics now. There is an obligation most governments feel and are mandated to pursue the economic interests of their province and balancing off the environmental interests as well. Where do you think that balance lies with this project?
Well, this project specifically, I think it's very difficult to weigh those kind of cost-benefit balance, especially when you have such a precarious situation for us here on the coast at the very end of the line. If we're talking about
You
that
mean politically?
politically, yes. You know, because the difficulty becomes, you know, we often politicize projects. We politicize a lot of infrastructure. I think partly where we cut off our own nose to spite our face on that score is that we don't consider the wider implications to the country. And so I'm going out on a bit of a limb here. I love BC. I'm a very passionate British Columbian. My personal opinion is on the project, they didn't have all the First Nations buy-in to the project. And for me personally, if you don't get 100%, you have 0% on these kind of projects. So I just want to be clear, I'm not necessarily endorsing this project, but again, you have to weigh the implications across the whole country, to the whole industry. What is it going to have? You know, so I feel like we shouldn't necessarily ignore that. But you know, for right here home in BC, I'm not very confident that that project is going to go forward. Just for the simple stated reason of First Nations case against it. I mean, you know, full disclosure, I'm a very active BC Liberal. Even if our government had been re-elected in a very clear majority, I still don't know what the health of this project would have been simply on that score. Again, because First Nations have not been meaningfully included in the economy or the country really since its inception. So for now, the federal government and the provincial governments are playing a lot of catch-up trying to get First Nations meaningfully involved in projects like these. And companies like Kinder Morgan, in my estimation, did not do an adequate enough job creating that kind of inclusion, if you will.
We've heard the phrase social license before, and the Prime Minister has used it. Stuart, this is for you. You've mentioned in some of our earlier discussions that you think this is less of a climate issue than a social issue around this pipeline. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think you can't simply take any one of those elements in isolation, the political alone or the climate science alone. Let's accept that these are valid sets, but it's the interplay between them where I think the progress we can make as a society. Right now, we mentioned 2050 a few times in very relevant contexts. I would add one context as well that today I was just reading the World Economic Forum has told us that our pension shortfall in this country in 2050 will be on the order of $13 trillion. We can make choices, very significant choices in how we plan towards that future. If you look politically, just in broad strokes on the topic at hand, and we're here to talk about this topic, it's up there, are Canada's pipeline approvals at odds with our climate commitments, and I want to stay focused on that. If you look at how Alberta, under a tremendous amount of pressure, has in the last couple of years stepped up with a hard cap on emissions of 100 megatons. It right now is at the production level of about 70, and it has developed a broad pact in the oil sands industry to operate within that cap. At the same time, it has moved forward with a carbon pricing structure that applies to Alberta, and now with BC also out there with a more long-standing carbon pricing system, we have got the whole country on that. That's a
most of the country.
There's a prod to get
Premier
everyone in.
Yes,
so in the sense
outlier.
that there's a way to get all the sheep in the pen and close the door on it. So whether they all want to be there all the time, we'll see. But we have that right now. We've achieved that. That's something that could be a legacy for Prime Minister Trudeau. Because of that accomplishment, we were able subsequently to see the sign-off on the Oceans Protection Program, $1.5 billion, with the approval of British Columbia, having got to what the BC government defined as what the 5 conditions being accomplished. All of these things are hooked up to one particular project, the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project. If you imagine a situation where, for whatever reason, the expected construction start date of this fall or late summer doesn't occur, or delayed, or doesn't ever happen, I think one of the first things that would happen is we would see a change in political winds. It would bring about, for sure, a change to the climate commitments Alberta's made. It would quite possibly result in a change of government to the United Conservative Party. Federally, I think there's a lot at stake. That's why we see a federal cabinet taking the moves it has. It's been stepping in very deliberate ways, ways that obviously not everyone loves. That therefore it's clear that they haven't sold to everybody, perhaps never can. But as we see the change that would occur from removing a properly constructed pipeline that's within our climate envelope to occur, then we're going to see a political sea change. And that won't be good for the climate. So the argument I'm making here, just to boil it down in my final few words on this point, is that if the pipelines that do get through the tests of our regulatory systems, which have been strengthened and conditioned by many decades of activism in Canada, and if we don't then build them, we will more likely go the way of a country like the USA, which is hardly an example to us, especially this week in light of its new posture on Paris. So if that's the future that you wish for, I think that we have to be very careful in how we get there, or whether we get to where we think we're going.
Speaking of Paris, and yes, there is a notable pullout. Kathy, to you, we're not the only resource-rich country that signed on to the Paris Accord. Are there other lessons from other resource-rich countries that we can take away in terms of how they're going to be meeting their commitments?
Norway, I think, has done more. Norway's going a lot further, both to address emissions within Norway and also the combustion emissions. And I want to come back to this concept of a zero carbon barrel of oil. The only zero carbon barrel of oil is one that doesn't get burned, because the vast majority of the emissions, regardless of what the upstream extraction emissions are, happen when it gets burned. So in the case of Norway, they are looking to offset some of those emissions through investments in carbon sequestration in Indonesia and other South Pacific countries, and they are moving much more quickly than other countries to be 100% reliant on electric vehicles for transportation. But it is true that the leaders on addressing climate change tend not to be the countries that are economically dependent on producing fossil fuels, like Canada. We are not a leader, but I think the issue is not, as is often suggested, shutting down the oil industry overnight. When we're building new pipelines, we are expanding the oil industry. So the question is, how quickly do we phase out our economic reliance on fossil fuels, not do we shut it down overnight?
Solomon, on the business case on that, what about that time between trying to phase out and become less reliant on fossil fuels and moving to renewables? Because there is that gap, and it's a noticeable gap, where people still need to work, they still need to be paid, people need to pay mortgages, etc. Where do you see that balance there?
I think the balance has to be very gradual. I think that industry really needs to take leadership on that score. I think leadership has been taken by the industry. I think that there have been a lot of changes and a lot of innovation in terms of how these carbons are developed and what we're doing internally within the country around that. Is it perfect? Is there such a thing as a zero carbon fuel? No, there isn't. We're burning it. Yeah, the sun. And I'm playing.
It just hangs up there all the time.
It does, and I'm part of the industry that's trying to harness that. I think that where the transition period is right now, and particularly where we are, we have aging infrastructure. We have an aging pipeline that's already in use by Kinder Morgan. Again, we know that globally there's going to be there still is a transition period from basically burning petrol, refined oil for transportation in multiple facets and multiple industries. There's no getting around that at this point. When we talk about electric cars and lots of other products, what is that change going to be into our infrastructure? At one time, we were all using horses and buggies. right? And what happened to all the farriers and all of the blacksmiths that provided the shoes and the, the wagon makers, all those things? Where did that transition come in? I mean, the bottom line is, that things are going to have to change. The industry is going to change. The money's not going to be there. The jobs aren't going to be there forever. We even have a finite amount of oil. We know that, right? We can't just keep continuing on to burn it. So in terms of where does that transition happen or how does it happen, industry, I think, in particular, has to take the leadership on that, and I think that they are. I mean, I deal with, of course, in my work, a lot of investors who are invested into a wide range of things, and we are seeing a lot of investments moving now from fossil fuels into renewable energy. And, we keep talking about the new economy. It's here. It's already happened. Last year was the first year we saw more investments into renewable energy products or innovations than we did into petrol, into oil-based industry. So it's already here. It's already happening. It's a reality.
Grand Chief, if this project does not get built, what about the argument that that will mean that oil will have to simply be shipped more by rail, and other means will have to be made in order to ship it, and it could be less safe? And we've all seen the photos and remembered the disaster at Lac Mégantic. Is there a concern around that, even as we taper down off of fossil fuels?
I think no, absolutely not. I agree with the previous speaker in terms of we're in a state of transition, transformation. I've been an Indigenous leader now for 43 years. I was chief of our community for 14. I've been tribal chair for probably 15 years. I'm in my 7th term as president of the UBCIC, and there's absolutely no one that could convince me that the buffalo are coming back. It's the same with the fossil fuel industry. It's sunsetting. There's already a transition. Investors are making those decisions, and that's the reality. All of the fear-mongering about the loss of jobs and so on and so forth. I was up at the tar sands last winter, and we did a flyover. I've been up to the tar sands on a number of occasions, and during the course of our flyover, the chopper pilot, who does a lot of work up there, was telling us about the automation that's coming to the tar sands. So industry itself, in response to the drop in the collapse in the oil prices, are automating a lot more quickly, and a lot of the oil workers that depended on those jobs are losing their jobs. So again, there's a very self-serving group of people out there that are trying to squeeze the last dollar out of the fossil fuel industry, that are doing all of this rhetoric about what about this, what about that. And I think we need to get on with the program in terms of the transition. I heard that discussion today on CBC. The environment minister was on and was really hard pressed to answer any of the questions that was presented to her with a lot of these questions and whatnot. The Trudeau government is very condescending and paternalistic, paying lip service to the need to make the transition, but not right now. Well, you don't transition over a 40 or a 50 or a 60-year period. You make those decisions now. And again, I suggest that the market is making those decisions, the political process is making those decisions. 60% of British Columbians said that they don't embrace this grandiose scheme of the previous government and resource development and this boom and bust model of economic development. The labor force attached to these projects are transient in nature. They come from the outside, they come in, the project's done, and they leave. There's no sustainability in economic terms attached to this dying industry. So, we just need to ensure that we have an orderly transition. I heard another statistic today. In the States, there's something like 400,000 jobs in solar in a very, very short space of time, and they compared that to coal. And there was, I think it was 30 or 40,000 jobs in coal and 400,000 in renewables. So that's the new reality. And, you know, all of this other noise, you know, about how it's in the national interest. Fossil fuels, I understand, represents 1.5% to 2% of national GDP. And that's mostly centered in Alberta and Saskatchewan as opposed to the rest of the country. So it's not like, you know, the economy and, you know, economic Armageddon is hanging on the balance of whether the Trans Mountain Pipeline goes through or not.
And just to that statistic, and Georgia, I have one more question to you before we go. I think the last check was 76,000 people, from the people who dig the coal all the way up to the managers, are employed in the coal industry in the United States. More people work at Arby's than that. Very interesting comparison. George, quickly to you. If the pipeline does get built, BC has touted itself, and perhaps in various forms and various governments, as being a climate leader. If this pipeline gets built, does it get to keep that moniker?
But if it gets built, it's the federal government's pipeline, not British Columbia's pipeline. And
That's the way they'll say it. That's what the provincial government would say if they're opposed to it and it goes through, correct?
what will they say?
They'll say, oh, it's the federal government's pipeline.
But I think that would be right in this case. I mean, it's only going to happen if this Green NDP alliance stays together in government. It will only happen if the federal government chooses to override the express wishes of the people of British Columbia. So, so the question is whether the Liberal Party of Canada and the Justin Trudeau government is a climate leader or a credible climate actor. And that's something that the Prime Minister has to decide. There is actually an enormous opportunity for him, now that Trump has made a mockery of U.S. activity on climate, to play a much bigger role representing the Americas and elsewhere as a kind of a new face that can push an aggressive climate agenda. It's very hard for him to do so if he's constantly propping up these and having to defend these major new oil infrastructure projects. So I think he's going to figure out eventually that it's in his interest internationally, and I hope he can see it's going to be in his interest domestically to change his mind on this.
We have covered a lot of ground in about 35 or 40 minutes, and we appreciate all of you weighing in with all this. It's amazing the breadth of the topic, and we appreciate you all being very patient. You've put in your questions now, and now it's time to read some of those questions. As we said, it's on the Alumni Engagement website. You can continue to do so. I'm going to read the top question right now with 21 likes. Our government has an obligation to support the economy in BC and the rest of Canada. There is also an obligation to protect the environment. How do we balance both the economy and the environment? Is there an option that is good for both? Stuart, I'll start with you on this one. I know we've covered some of this ground before, but there's anything new that you think where that balance can be found?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. You know, I think a lot of what I hear in this is that there are two solitudes in this country. Just as sometimes on university campuses, there's two sides of the campus. There's the humanities and the science people, and you see that in the West. There's BC and Alberta. There's the West and the East. There's the U.S. and Canada. You know, I think in these, you know, there's opportunities here to take the things that are natural assets of this country. You know, we don't do everything well. We're not the greatest manufacturers of automobiles in the world. I don't think you could easily argue that. We don't produce the world's greatest orange juice or the most iPhones in the world, last I heard. But we do have certain things that are uniquely ours, and amongst those things are the natural resources that we have, I think, been able to become, despite being this by population little tiny country, a member of the G7. We're a morally authoritative country on the national stage. You wonder, how did we get there? How did this little tiny country of only 35 million people, or whatever it is this week, get to that? Well, we got there because of our natural resources, and I think the thing that runs through the spirit of the country, when you go, you know, maybe you have to go a few miles outside of, you know, downtown Vancouver to really start to hear this, but a country that values those resources and the ability to innovate. And, you know, I don't say lightly or jokingly that there are people in this country truly are working towards a zero carbon barrel of oil. It's not a joke. It's not to be laughed off. Are they there now? No, they're not. They've got work to do to get there. But I think if you look at the alternatives that we've got, we could landlock our crude oil. We could send it by rail. So by doing that, right away we are reducing the price that we get. And if you look at it in, through an economist lens, you very quickly realize that you are setting a very high price on reducing Canada's carbon intensity, as well as all of these political problems that arise in our complex system. I think the thing we can do when we are so reliant, 80% of our energy diet comes from fossil fuels. Maybe some of us hate that fact. Maybe we should all hate that fact, but it's the fact we have. Right now, if you take just one fossil fuel, natural gas, that's about 1/3 of our fuel supply in Canada. It's going to go up over the next 20 years. It's going to go up to over 40%. And it's not going to be easy just to get off that. You look at cars right now, we're all talking about electric cars. Who's not excited by electric cars? Who wouldn't like to be driving a nice shiny Tesla? Lots of people. But the fact is only 0.13% of our cars today are fossil fuels, are electric cars. And here's the closing point on that, which is, look, we should be pouring innovation and good intentions into those electric cars so we have more of them. But with the more than 99% of other cars, we also owe it to ourselves to improve those all the time, to not have so much waste heat, to use the irreplaceable fossil fuels more efficiently. All of those things that we have to do. And we can do both. The idea that you've got to drop this one, you have to villainize fossil fuels, they're terrible, evil, must stop them. I don't see most of Canada buying that. I don't see most of the public buying it because they are out there every day consuming these things and they seem to sleep at night okay. But it doesn't mean we can stand still.
Catherine, I think you wanted to respond to that?
Because I think Stuart is being very optimistic about innovation in the fossil fuel sector. My sense is that Canadians are extremely well educated. It's a prosperous country. Why are we so afraid of innovation in clean energy, tech, and other areas that we could shift our economy to? Because right now, by expanding our production of fossil fuels for export, when we know that that's not consistent with limiting climate change to anything below 3.6 Celsius, which would be twice that in Canada, by the way, we're doing one of two things. We are either saying, well, we're not going to stop climate change, so we might as well prosper as long as we can, or we're counting on the rest of the world to do that transition for us by putting our fossil fuel industry out of business. I think it would be a much smarter thing for the federal government to choose, to actually choose and invest in through financial signals and also support for education and tech, making that transition sooner rather than waiting.
Can I just make a very quick point? I didn't pull out my iPhone in order to, send a message or something.
You can
appreciate
vote for
that.
questions.
Yep.
10 years ago, this was invented. It has revolutionized many things. And when we look at how low the current penetration of something like electric vehicles now, and you think about system change that can occur through entrepreneurship in combination with government policy and leadership, it can actually happen quite quickly, which is good because it needs to happen quite quickly in this case.
Grand Chief, I have a challenging question for you, and that's the top question we have. What is the most compelling argument for these pipelines, and what is your response to the argument?
Excuse me?
I did say it would be a challenging question. Is there in your mind, a viable, or at least from what you've heard, a viable reason for this pipeline?
No, absolutely not. And if there was, I would certainly share it. The economics of pipelines is, and again, I go back to this business of it's not sustainable. If you are involved in constructing a pipeline, you don't get out of bed every single morning for 40 years, pack your little black lunch pail, and go off and work on the pipeline and come home and then retire and so on and so forth. You would be amazed at how quickly those lines go into the ground and are covered over, and that enormous workforce is there for such a short period of time, and then they move on to the next project. I know this. The Southern Crossing project in the southern part of BC went through. If I had to guess, I'd say 11 years ago. And one of my sons worked on that project, and they rented a house in Grand Forks. You know, people exploit this boom and bust business, and they were paying $4,000 a month rent for this tiny little bungalow. They were employed for maybe 5 or 6 weeks, and they really enjoyed that employment. They enjoyed the income, and then it was gone. And you drove by where the line went in, and there was cattle and horses out there grazing and so on and so forth. The pipeline company makes the money. It's a Texas-based company. It's not labor intensive after it goes into the ground. There's a handful of people that operate it. So let's not kid ourselves that this is the economic panacea. If governments want to contribute to the economy and create long-term sustainable jobs, they're going to have to make a serious move towards renewables, which do create those long-term sustainable opportunities. And again, we're in that transition, that transformation, and change is really, really difficult. It's really challenging. But the risks attached, and nobody's talked about the risks of a catastrophic tanker spill out here in a heavily congested Burrard Inlet, which would absolutely devastate the economy of Vancouver, the tourism industry, and all of those values. Not to mention, you know, the marine ecosystems, a pipeline rupture somewhere along the line. And this BS about the ocean protection program that Trudeau came out and paid lip service to is an absolute joke. The Nathan E. Stewart tug that went down up in Haltzik territory, just a very small diesel spill demonstrated there's absolutely no capacity to clean up a small spill like that. And here they're talking about putting the West Coast and the environment and everything that represents at risk when there isn't that capacity to do anything. And we all know that heavy oil, dirty oil, goes straight to the bottom. There's no way to clean it up. So, you know, there's no benefit in it for British Columbians, certainly for Indigenous peoples or anyone. That's why the vast majority of British Columbians oppose these heavy oil pipeline projects. It's because of the inherent risk that's been demonstrated around the world vis-a-vis ruptures that happen on a regular basis. It's part of the industry. And why should we be hoodwinked into considering this somehow is in the national interest and support this? And I think the last provincial election was a clear indication that the general public in British Columbia are saying, no, thank you. There's got to be something better than you know, some dirty oil pipeline.
Thank you, Grand Chief. Solomon, question here, and perhaps somebody has written, many First Nations support pipeline development. Why are their voices not heard? Or perhaps more of them not heard more broadly?
Well, I think there's the overarching presence of media in terms of what sells news and what moves. You know, and I think that's the case of any issue. It's not specific to resources. You know, often the voice of dissent is what we're interested in hearing, because by and large we understand what the other side is for, and that can be applied to really any context. But what I wanted to bring up, and just listening into the conversation here, I think something that also doesn't quite go acknowledged as why are we trying to build these pipelines. And we can talk about industry, we can talk about our country, we can talk about national interests, but the reality is it's our greed of trying to maintain a lifestyle that just ultimately is not sustainable in the planet. I mean, there are so many carbon-intensive industries or industries that really pollute the planet. You know, we don't like to talk about our clothing, we don't like to talk about our building methods. There's a lot here that is going unacknowledged that really does play a major factor into climate change. You know, I think greed is driving this pipeline, but it's not just the greed of, and mind you, I use these contexts, I'm as someone who works in industry, it's not just the executives' greed at the top of, you know, trying to get benefits for their shareholders. It's for everyone. It's everyone who wants their Starbucks right away, everyone who wants delivery pizza at 2 in the morning. It's everyone who wants to go to Bali or to some far and away place to go on vacations. I mean, it's part of this whole Western lifestyle, and as Stuart rightly brought up, we've got a ballooning national debt. We've got a system, particularly with entitlements, that just is unsustainable. We have a healthcare system that presently is unsustainable. We have a social welfare system. You know, using INAC as a good broad example of government treatment of its citizens. 79 cents doesn't even leave the door in INAC on the dollar, meaning that 79 cents is kept for basically paying staff, is the largest expense. It's paying for their union holidays, it's paying for their educations, it's paying for a lot of their benefits, health, dental, medical, a lot of these things that go on top of. And I know because I was a public servant, I worked in the public service, I know the deal that public servants get, and there are many incredible hardworking people. So I'm not saying that they are bums or leeches by any extent of the imagination. Many people I admire in the public service, but it ultimately is unsustainable, and we can't change that. It's the same for the oil patch workers, right? Those jobs are not going to be there in 50 years. We have to grow up. And it's the same with a lot of entitlements. It's the same with a lot of how we run society. So as much as people can oppose the pipelines, ultimately you're also playing a part of it as well, too.
Stuart, a question for you. Even if Canada meets its climate targets, stays with the Paris Agreement, what happens if the rest of the world doesn't?
Well, that's interesting because right now we're potentially tracking, you know, to a status where we have considerably shrunk the oil sands, or the rate of growth of the oil sands, or the ability of the oil sands product to reach its highest value by reaching the markets where it has the greatest value. What will we do then when we still are consuming an enormous amount of fossil fuels in Canada? That just the domestic, right now we're spending about $20 billion a year to import foreign oil. The idea, when I've heard this from the leader of the Green Party of BC, that we should stop producing oil sands oil and get all of our oil from Saudi Arabia until it's gone, until it's all gone, and by then we won't need it anyways. It's an intriguing one because there are countries that aren't investing in innovation or carbon taxes or their societies the way that Canada is. We really are a leader in all of these regards. The idea that we should take what is tracking to be one of the best and cleanest, lowest carbon barrels of oil in the world. It's already better than some. It is. It's a fact. And please, I think I have the talking stick. And the idea that we should continue to be consumers, going through a transition process that we must do at some pace that we're trying to work out, I think the thing that's causing most of the friction. But to consume our oil from places that do not meet our own standards while curtailing the production of that in a place where we're heavily investing in innovation and responsibly using the benefits of that. I think that this is something that we need to use our university place as an exploration spot to keep getting at it, because right now it seems to go from one extreme to the other. It's finding that middle ground of saying, okay, we know we are going to be using this for a long time. How do we best do it?
This is a question I'm going to get to some of you in just a moment. This is specifically for Professor Catherine Harrison. Can you talk about the Notley government's climate change policy and the opposition to it? This gets into that interprovincial relationship that we've been hinting at.
So the There's quite a parallel, I think, between the federal government's climate plan and the province of Alberta. In both cases, it's establishing a carbon price in exchange for expansion of oil production. At the federal level, there was a bargain between building pipelines and establishing a national carbon price. And similarly, within the province of Alberta, there is the much vaunted hard cap on emissions, but that is something close, getting close, 45% maybe higher than what the emissions currently are in that sector. So it is in exchange for increasing emissions from the oil industry within Alberta, reducing emissions from, especially from coal-fired electricity production, aiming to level off Alberta's emissions, so they're increasing and then leveling off by 2030. And the oil industry is also treated somewhat differently in how carbon is priced compared to average households who pay a carbon tax on every kilogram of emissions, whereas the oil industry pays only at the margin, so they get a better deal. They're not contributing as much into the coffers of the provincial government. So it is very much it was progress. It is establishing a carbon price, but it does so in a unique way that I think was designed to protect growth and international reputation of Alberta's oil industry.
Now, was all of that contingent upon, we've heard this, that this pipeline was to be approved by the Trudeau government only if they agreed to that hard cap and brought in a carbon tax? That was part of that narrative, was it not? That
Alberta acted
I'll give
first.
you a pipeline, but you have to bring in a carbon tax.
Alberta acted first, but they had not committed to increase the carbon price to $50 per ton. They nobody did it sort of explicitly, but I would say it was a pretty clear bargain. Alberta got a pipeline, BC got approval of Pacific Northwest LNG and Site C. The federal government got their carbon pricing agreement, but it is not an agreement. The whole package is not consistent with meeting our 2030 target, let alone the deeper reductions that are needed thereafter.
George, this is a little bit more, well, perhaps esoteric is the right word, but it's a broader question. If a province can block the federal government that has the constitutional mandate to look at the greatest good for the whole Confederation, then what does it mean to be a Canadian? Feel free to condense that down if you want.
No, this is actually what concerns me the most in a lot of ways. Because if you think about part of the same institutional logic that British Columbia could use to say no to the Kinder Morgan pipeline in the face of federal authority, the province of Alberta or the province of Saskatchewan could use to say no to the federal government of Canada in imposing climate policy. That concerns me greatly, since my first principle is trying to, in as just a way as possible, move us through that clean energy transformation. So I think it's very difficult. What I would say to that is the argument of the Prime Minister and others is that somehow a process where we got to proving Kinder Morgan is a reflection of the national interest. I think that's just ridiculous. We've never had a discussion about what the national interest is with respect to balancing energy and environment, especially in the climate file and oil sands in this country. We did have a National Energy Board review, and it's really interesting. I would strongly urge people to look at the new report by the hand-picked panel of the Trudeau government to review the NEB process, which they had committed to doing. And it basically makes the argument that we've been making for a while, that trying to decide the public interest based on a project-by-project review, it just doesn't work. So you need to have a more comprehensive framework that first sets out what your energy and climate policies are, and then you need to have processes which make sure each individual project decision is consistent with that. We haven't done that. And so where I go with that is I'm hoping that we can have a better process for policy making Canada-wide and with respect to specific projects that can help build a stronger and more legitimate discussion about how to make these trade-offs, especially when one province is pitted against another. It's a very, very difficult challenge, and I'm a little bit worried, which is why Kinder Morgan should choose not to go ahead with the pipeline.
Game, set, match on that one. Yes, of course, yes, Solomon.
Chime in on that point. I mean, because it's a very interesting question, and I'm speaking more now as just a private citizen than I would be an expert on industry or business. But as a First Nations person, as a status Indian, I have no connection whatsoever to the ideal that is Canada. Frankly, if I'm being honest, I mean, I have no association. When I look at the flag, when I look at our Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, none of those things really apply to me. That's not really a part of who we are. So I think where the gap in that question, and which is really part of the whole picture right now, is how are First Nations meaningfully engaged and involved in that process? Because we're talking about the province and the feds arguing, that's all relatively moot if First Nations aren't involved in a meaningful way, because the reality is, we are, and how I've always understood our treaties is that we're 50-50 partners. We brought the land, you brought the people, and together we are Canada. And in any business arrangement, that equity is absolutely worth something. And even as a bit of a provincialist, I strongly identify with British Columbia. It's been my home, it's where I've grown up. When I would charge to say I disagree with that statement that we need a national energy policy, because I think provinces should have the final say and decision on what goes on within our provincial borders. And again, speaking as an Indigenous person, when I look at Canada, it doesn't really exist to me. It's a 150-year-old company, really, that was formed to structure how we take care of Indian land, really. And perhaps Grand Chief would have something to add to that, but so and yeah, like I said, I don't really, that doesn't resonate with me at all.
Grand Chief.
Well, I agree. It really disturbed me when the Harper government was here. Joe Oliver, the Minister of Natural Resources at the time, we forget so quickly, but there was some very harsh statements made on the part of the Harper government, the national interest. There was some talk about an energy corridor, highly secured energy corridor going from Alberta to the coast, that these projects were so vital to the Canadian economy. And a secure energy corridor is shorthand for bringing in the military to ensure that these projects are rammed through. When the Trudeau government talks about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, he talks about the human rights of Indigenous peoples, he talks about no relationship is more important than the relationship between the Government of Canada and Indigenous peoples. That was the rhetoric we heard during the campaign. The Minister of Justice and the Minister of Indigenous Affairs went to New York and said, without reservation, we fully embrace the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So there has to be a consistency with that movement and taking our considerations, our worldview when it comes to energy projects. But at that point, he completely dismisses us and says, this is in the national interest, meaning not us. But the executives in fossil fuel industry, his political schemes that he's cooking up with the carbon tax, the trade-offs with the pipeline, and so on and so forth. And again, a lot of the court cases that are moving ahead, a lot of the evidence and so on and so forth revolves around those issues, that hypocrisy, those contradictions and whatnot. What's lacking here in this country is we do not have a credible Canadian environmental assessment process. We don't have a credible NEB process. And here in British Columbia, the BC environmental assessment process is absolutely a terrible, terrible gap because it was this government that rubber-stamped the Tazeko's Prosperity 1 and 2 projects, which were rejected federally in both occasions. British Columbia rubber stamps anything that comes forward. And so because of those gaps, There's nothing to rely on to assure that these projects are being properly adjudicated with all of the issues considered. And so the only option we're left with is the courts and the political process. And at the end of the day, if we can no longer rely on government policy, the integrity of the Crown, if we cannot rely on the courts to defend our interests, then we have to look to ourselves to do that. And that means on the land itself. And I would suggest to you, if we go down that path with this project, with this issue, we're not going to be alone. There's going to be an enormous part of society that will support us. And that's a reflection on the failure of Canada and British Columbia. So the issue of climate leadership is, aside from eloquent lip service on the part of the Trudeau government and the self-serving lip service on the part of the existing Clark government, there isn't that type of leadership that's necessary to deal with this problem, this conundrum in a long-term way. And that's what's necessary.
We have just a few more moments before we're going to wrap this up, so we're going to ask for some closing comments from each of you. We're going to start at this end with Stuart. What is the most important takeaway from our discussion tonight? We've covered a lot of ground that you want the audience to take away from you.
You know, I think we can go from the economics to the environment. We can go from the fact that crude oil pays the rent for Canada as a country today, to the fact that it is a substance, crude oil, that is imperfect, that must be improved, that we must achieve transition from. It's one that our laws, regulations, political leadership has put us on a path to being the best in the world. And I know there's a sort of industry growing up to argue the other side of that, and that's good. That's why we're an open, free society. But it must be said that we are working really hard in our universities. You can find the evidence of that in the patent office, in the SSHRC grants, all of the grants that go out to scientists. You can find it in our industrial performance. You can find it in the fact that we remain this country probably in the G7, Canada. What are we doing there? We're there because we do all of this so well. And I think a lot of Canadians do have confidence in our basic ability to keep doing that well.
Solomon, you're next, and I forgot to mention, I probably should have put a minute timeline or minute limit on this, but if you go over a little bit, that's okay. That's for everyone.
I think my quickest thoughts would be no place better in the world to develop these resources than here. I do stand behind that statement. I do think that Canada can have more robust regulatory and environmental framework than other countries. With that being said, I support the last statements that I made as well about First Nations inclusion and working with the provinces as well. I think really an important perspective from the Indigenous standpoint, is that 150 years ago, Grand Chief Philip and I couldn't leave the reserve without a pass, right? And 50 years ago, roughly, we got the vote. And just recently, we got the duty to consent. And I think that we will see a veto. It's not a matter of if, it's when. We will have a veto on these projects. We will have a veto on a lot of different things. Like I said, Canada, we are the 50-50 partnership. So, it's about preparing for the future and preparing for that reality. I think Canada has been betrayed by a lot of its political and business leadership in terms of ignoring including Indigenous people in a meaningful way in the both economy and governance of this country for a long, long time. For many of the young people in the audience here who are just starting their careers, working with First Nations is going to be the most important aspect of your work going forward. There's absolutely no way around it. And if you don't have that knowledge, I'm afraid the economy is going to leave you behind.
George.
Our Prime Minister is fond of saying the environment and the economy go hand in hand, and it's a lovely phrasing, and it's probably true on aggregate in the long run, but it doesn't mean that individual big fossil fuel projects make environmental sense or make sense with our environmental policy. Significantly increasing fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions does not go hand in hand with significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is exactly what we need to do as soon as possible. That clean energy transformation is both feasible and affordable, and there's a lot of concern, think about the economic cost of transition. It's also going to be fabulously exciting economically. An immense amount of wealth is already being generated, and it will provide for hundreds of thousands of jobs. And it's an exciting thing that people need to, I think, just really, like you said, with First Nations, well, it's also clean energy and First Nations, which I guess is what you do, come to think of it, that, that's where the future is, and we need to get on that.
Catherine.
So I've been thinking ever since it was asked about this question, what does it mean to be a Canadian? So 50 years ago, when it was Canada's 100th birthday, I will confess, I was a little kid in school, and my very favorite teacher pointed to a map of Canada on the front board and pointed in northern Alberta and said, that's our country's future. We have this amazing thing, we're to contribute to the world. And I grew up and I became a chemical engineer, and my first few years of my career, I worked in the tar sands, because that was how I was going to make the country a better place. Well, 50 years later, we know that a sustainable future for our children is not consistent with developing that resource. And I think if we define what it means to be Canadian, to be an oil-based economy, and to continue to double down on that by expanding our production, we are either doing our children an environmental disservice, or we are doing them an economic disservice by delaying the transition to the kind of innovative, clean energy economy that Canada could achieve.
And lastly, Grand Chief.
First of all, we're not talking about crude oil. Every time I hear a reference made to crude oil, I hear violins in the background. We're talking about dirty oil. We're talking about bitumen. We're talking about a highly contaminant, a toxic material. And the proposal that's being advanced is somehow we should embrace that and be piped through our province, put on tankers, and drop to our knees every night and pray there's not a pipeline rupture or a tanker spill. And there's absolutely very little return in undertaking that tremendous risk. And what gets me out of bed every single morning is my wife Joan and I have been blessed with 15 grandchildren. And the issue is about climate change, global warming, what that represents, and the future of our grandchildren and future generations. It's not about Kinder Morgan. It's not about Ian Anderson. It's not about shareholders, and the profits they'll make out of this ill-conceived, ill-advised Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline. And that's why we're going to prevail in this. And this is going to be very challenging for everyone until we make that transition, until there is a government with the intestinal fortitude and the integrity to sit down and develop those NEB processes. Environmental assessment processes are incredibly rigorous, both nationally and provincially, that all of us, including Indigenous people, can rely on. And when it's run through those processes, we can all say, hey, look, it's got to be a project that we can all support. Those conditions do not exist at the moment. So the answer is no.
Thank you, all of you, for weighing in on a very controversial topic. A lot of ground covered. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone here who sent in your questions. And thank you to everyone who sent in questions. I'm sorry we could not get to all of them. There were, I think, about 100, there were a lot. So we had to be a bit selective. But thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'm going to turn things back over to Deanna for just a moment.
Wow. I feel humbled and enriched and excited about the many great minds that are working so hard to inform us in some of the most important questions. Let's give them another round. Please join me in thanking our moderator and our panel.